In the spirit of the Tholos Circle, where ancient thinkers gathered to debate the issues of today, this is Tholos Talks. Through deep insight and thought-provoking dialogue, we offer the tools to decode complexity and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome back. This is episode 4 of Coffee, Trade, and Tech, the series of Tholos Talks that unpacks the 21st century issues facing the global economy. I'm Jake Jennings, chair of Basilinna's America's Trade and Tech practice. And today we have Ryan Berg, director of the Americas program and head of the Future of Venezuela initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. First of all, let's start with your career journey. What brought you to public policy, and when did you first become interested in Western Hemisphere?
Well, thanks for having me on, Jake. It's a pleasure to be here. I started my journey as an academic. I thought the academic route was the one that I wanted to take and pursue. Indeed, I finished a PhD. I always had a bit of reservation about how much policy impact I was having. I did feel as though some of my research was a bit disconnected from real, tangible public policy outcomes in real public policy problems where I felt I could be part of the solution to some of these challenging issues that were going on in the world of foreign affairs. And so I began to think about some of the issues I was interested in from a theoretical perspective and thinking about the types of questions and indeed regions that I could apply them to. And I came upon Latin America that fit so nicely with a lot of the things that I was interested in from an academic perspective, things like constitutional design, institutions, democracy, how politics functions within democracies. Latin America, amazingly, has the democracy piece down for the most part, but it doesn't have the institutions down. It doesn't have the constitutional design. It doesn't have the governance and lack of corruption that the region needs to truly thrive. And so I did feel as though the theoretical things that I was interested in could have practical public policy application in this field.
So you're at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS. How did you end up there, and what areas are you focused on right now?
I started my public policy scholar career at a different think tank called the American Enterprise Institute, AEI for short. I moved over to CSIS for the opportunity, frankly, to build a team of Americanists who care a lot about the region, to get more executive experience and management experience, even though our team is small, humble team of 5 full-timers. I feel like we punch well above our weight and we put out some good programming and papers and ideas. That was really the experience that I wanted. I wanted that more executive and managerial experience, having kind of cut my teeth in public policy scholarship at AEI. There's a certain point, Jake, at which you become a sort of very good public policy scholar, but there are some other skills that you need to be able to navigate in this industry. And part of it is the fundraising experience. Part of it is putting together a team, understanding what kind of programming you need to work on, taking it a step further. And that's what CSIS allowed me to do.
So you were senior fellow at the Americas program, and now you're the director of the group. What's been your biggest surprise over the last couple of years of taking on that role?
Well, frankly, Jake, it was the reason that I came over to CSIS was because I wanted that managerial and more executive experience. And I've got to say the most surprising thing is just how much time of my day it takes, right? Sometimes we joke that we work in a think tank, but we have very little time to think because there is a lot of administration that goes along with running a nonprofit program. A lot of it is looking for leads, trying to find some funding to do excellent programming, making sure you're reaching the right people. And then in this day, Jake, is actually thinking through the way in which you want to kind of package a narrative or package a set of research findings. It's not always as easy as just publishing a paper as we used to do. It's about thinking through all of those innovative ways that you want to reach the audience that you've identified and developed. One of the ways is what we're doing now, right? Recording videos, recording podcasts. It's a great way to reach a different audience, but in today's day, we really have to think about the way in which we reach the audience as well, not just the message. And that takes a lot of our day.
Moving over to the substantive policy issues, you have a recent publication focused on North America agricultural competitiveness. Little surprised of looking at agriculture, given that all the headlines right now range from, tariffs, technology, Panama, on and on and on. What made you look at the agricultural sector?
Indeed, Jake. We had a full conference last week on the issue of agricultural competitiveness in North America. We think that North America is the most important economic strategic bloc for the United States. We very much believe in a kind of fortress North America idea. In fact, before the election results last year, we launched something we call the USMCA Strategic Initiative, which is our in-house shop to house and contain all of our North America related work. This conference was our attempt to address the agricultural sector. And given everything that's going on in the North American relationship, we fully admit the headwinds and the challenges in our region, but we did think that competitiveness was a topic, a theme or a through line, if you will, for the conference that we all could agree upon. Right? We want our region to be more competitive. We want it to be more globally competitive. And what's unique about North America is that from an agricultural standpoint, not only are the bounties of our harvests just ridiculous, we can feed everyone that we need to feed in our region and much of the world, but also we have complementarity in a way that really benefits the nutrition and the food security of the region. We've got Canada that can produce a lot of grains. We've got the United States with its varied geographies can produce a lot of different things. And then obviously there's the more tropical climate in Mexico that can produce fruits and vegetables on a year-round basis for those of us in the northern reaches of the region that don't have those things normally on our shelves. So we thought it was a unique way to highlight the strengths that we have as a region. And frankly, there's no way to be economically competitive in other industries if you're not food secure and able to play a more strategic role globally on the agricultural level. So we thought it was an important thing to highlight. We're certainly not ag experts, but we learned a lot in the process of organizing this conference. 5 panels, bunch of different topics. It was fascinating.
It's interesting because Trump's Liberation Day, the reciprocal tariffs that were announced a few weeks ago, really seemed to focus on the trade in goods deficit through a formula and ended up hitting, Southeast Asia the hardest. It looked like, the Americas was largely spared because of the trade in goods surplus that the U.S. enjoys. Nonetheless, there was a 10% baseline tariff. How are you seeing that policy impact trade relations with Western Hemisphere, Latin America, South America in particular? And kind of where do you see it playing out in terms of technology?
So indeed, this is something that a lot of analysts have pointed out. Everything is relative when it comes to the reciprocal tariff regime. And so if you look at the 10% baseline tariff, which applied to pretty much all of the countries in the region, save for Venezuela, Nicaragua, and the country that I think we probably care about negotiating down with would be Guyana, right? Because they have oil and strategic resources that we want to engage with. But the rest of the region basically got the 10% baseline tariff. And compared to many other parts of the world, that's actually a relative advantage. So there is an opportunity, as you're writing for us in an upcoming, soon to be published commentary on the CSIS website, that there is a relative advantage here that companies can take advantage of if they have the strategic clarity and the acumen to see the opportunity. Since it is all relative, you have about the 10% baseline tariff for the region. One thing that I would note, Jake, is that North America specifically is still under a pretty significant tariff regime, even if it evaded the 10% baseline tariffs. So a lot of the other countries in the Americas got at least the 10% baseline tariff. Canada and Mexico were exempted from anything on reciprocal tariff day. But we have to remember that there's still a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. There's still a 25% tariff on autos minus US content whenever the rule is published on how exactly to calculate that. And then there is still a 25% tariff on all non-USMCA goods. So that's the incentive there. In my mind, it's really a North America incentive and it's a USMCA compliance incentive. You've got companies and supply chains now that are scrambling to become compliant because there's a big difference between no tariff and 25% tariff. In the past, the difference was between 0 and 2.5% most favored nation rate. Now there's actually a huge incentive to become North America compliant by the standards of the USMCA, which means checking all of the content, rules of origin requirement for your supply chain, and making sure that you meet those content requirements, which are usually much higher than they were under NAFTA.
It's interesting, as a kind of a trade person, most of our focus was on USTR, Commerce Department. It seems that the Department of Homeland Security and Customs Border Control is playing an ever increasing role in tariff and trade policy. Is that a surprise? Do they have the resources that are needed, the industry guidance in order to implement these exceptions or carve-outs?
It is a surprise, in my opinion, how the Trump administration is really a paradigm shifting administration in many ways. And I don't think I have the ability to say right now whether they have the resources and capacity to enforce and to monitor. It's one of those things where I have to give you the unsatisfying answer of we'll see. The time will tell. But this is definitely a paradigm shifting move for the administration.
Is it your sense that, because there is this kind of USMCA carve out more or less with the exception of steel and aluminum, does that bode well for industry and knowing that there's going to be some certainty in North America? And especially given that we've got the 2026 review coming up under USMCA?
I think the answer is yes and no. It's a bit more nuanced. There is certainty for now that the Trump administration has decided to carve out USMCA compliant trade. And they do seem to be very confident that they can do that because they're confident in the high levels of content requirements that many industries require to become USMCA compliant. So that means less China. That means more made in North America. However, you still have the USMCA review or renegotiation. We'll get to that later in the podcast. You still have a lot of other tariff uncertainties that could come into play. USTR Greer has said that there are 232 and 301 investigations in multiple industries that are going on that could affect critical parts of the North American economy. Obviously, we know there's semiconductors. Pharmaceuticals are something that they're also going to target. We've done some work at CSIS Americas on building a more secure pharmaceutical supply chain. Many of us saw what happened during COVID, and we didn't like the fact that we couldn't get PPE or basic pharmaceuticals, basic generic drugs, for example, because China were not giving us key active ingredients and precursors for some of those things. You could build out a more robust pharmaceutical supply chain in the North American region. We've done the work, and Mexico could play a key part of that. But with a bit of uncertainty about what's going to come with some of these investigations, I think it's not just that we have USMCA carve-outs in the current tariff scheme. It's also companies and industries looking at what could be coming ahead and not really knowing what's ahead of them, to say nothing, Jake, of what's going to happen in the review or the renegotiation.
As you talk to businesses, is your sense that companies are pausing investments to see how these trade issues play out, or are they moving forward with assumptions that there will be the availability of USMCA and trade issues will be worked out?
In my opinion, there are some industries where companies are plowing forward and they're continuing to invest, especially industries that see an advantage in being near the Mexico-US border. The real estate market there is still extremely tight. It's really hard to get any kind of warehouse or plot of land there where you could build a factory. You've got any number of industries going in that region. But there are a number of other industries, I think, that are sitting on the sidelines, or they are completing investments that they made under the last administration. But once those are complete, they're going to pause and try to take the pulse of the administration and what their strategy toward North America is going to be. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And I think we're seeing that in the predictions for regional growth, right? US GDP is estimated to be a little bit lower owing to some of the tariff maneuvers. Canada is definitely expected to be lower. Mexico is expected to not even reach 1% GDP growth this year as of the most recent forecast. So everybody has reduced their growth forecasts a little bit, I think, owing to some of the uncertainty in the landscape.
You brought up USMCA, and one of the big debates is it a review or renegotiations? I guess it depends on which Spanish interpretation you want to use. But as a practical matter, if it is a renegotiation, what do you see as the key issues for Mexico and for Canada that the U.S. is going to ask for, and vice versa? Are there some issues that our trading partners have that they want clarified in the review?
Well, Jake, the USMCA calls it a review. I think in practice, we think both of us probably agree it's going to look a little bit more like a renegotiation. Again, going back to your previous question about uncertainty, right? If it's more of a renegotiation and less of a review, that adds another layer. That doesn't mean it's going to be all for the negative. In fact, we could get more market access for U.S. companies. We could get a reduction in non-tariff barriers. We could get a resolution to some of these nettlesome issues that we have between the U.S. and Canada and U.S. and Mexico, things like digital services issues. The U.S. certainly wants greater agricultural access to the Canadian market. That's something that's been a forever issue in the bilateral relationship. Canada's supply management system, which keeps the Quebec farmers very happy and protects certain cultural products like French wines and cheeses in that region. Another issue, I think that'll be quite front and center for the United States and Mexico is greater access for the private sector in particular to the energy markets. Sheinbaum has indicated that she understands this and has moved slightly away from most policies, but still there's been a reversal of the market opening that was effectively completed under the Peña Nieto government. So that could be a major issue. If you listen to USTR Greer's Senate confirmation hearing, the thing that he said he is most concerned about in the review or the renegotiation is the issue of rules of origin. I think in the last couple of years, there's been a tremendous focus, Jake, on some of the inputs that are being assembled in Mexico mostly, but also in some industries in Canada that are Chinese in origin, but are yet passing as USMCA compliant because there's enough labor or value added put into them in North America that they're USMCA compliant. And if we raise those rates, those expected content requirements from 60s, 70s percentage, depending upon the industry, up into the 80s and the 90s, the idea is we can get more of these Chinese-made components out of the supply chains. And we can do something about some of these Chinese SOEs, these state-owned enterprises, setting up shop in Mexico to try to get a so-called backdoor into the North American market. So I expect the Trump administration to be laser focused on that issue as well. If we, in fact, see North America as strategic and as part of our fortress, our national security is economic security, and economic security is national security. If it starts at home, I suspect that the content requirements and therefore the China angle to be a major factor in the revision or renegotiation.
It makes me wonder, rather than increasing the rules of origin percentages, do you see a movement afoot to look at it, for certain sectors, maybe instead of rules of origin, country of origin? So you look at the ownership of the components and whether or not they would qualify under USMCA duty-free.
This is something that the United States first started talking about, Jake, and Canada has echoed it on some issues. I would note, however, that the Mexicans in particular have been somewhat resistant to this, at least Mexican voices that tend to nominate the trade space in Mexico, which is to say former NAFTA and USMCA negotiators, people like Juan Carlos Baker Pineda and Ken Smith Ramos and others. They've spoken at length about this issue, and they've said very passionately that would be a violation of the USMCA. Their position is in the sense that the Chinese companies that have set up shop in Mexico and abide by the rules of USMCA are in effect Mexican and eligible to get USMCA compliant carve-outs. And so there does seem to be some resistance south of the border to this idea that we would start looking at things from a country of origin and perspective.
I just wonder if the U.S. has somewhat crossed that bridge with the recent connected car transaction restrictions under the ICTS rules. As I understand it, national security claims do trump the trade agreement. So have they already crossed that bridge?
They've certainly laid the foundations for it, Jake. And they've essentially said a Chinese EV is essentially a computer on wheels, and there's too much sensitive data that would be transmitted back to a Chinese company, which would in effect have to give it to the CCP under their national security and lack of data protection laws. And therefore, we don't want any Chinese connected vehicles in the United States. But notably, Mexico has taken a very different approach. And you go to Mexico as often as I do, Jake. Pretty much every Uber you jump in at the airport in Mexico City is going to be a BYD.
Yeah, it'll be interesting how that plays out. And my sense is, and correct me, Ryan, but I don't think USTR is going to wait until 2026 to actually engage on these issues.
There seems to be two schools of thought within the Trump administration. Those who think that there's an advantage to moving it forward, both an advantage in terms of how the renegotiation plays out and how if the U.S. can get the best deal possible, but also an advantage, I would argue, in getting through this difficult moment faster so that then we have at least 3 years, or let's say around 3 years of the Trump administration with a solid foundation for a Fortress North America type of approach. I would very much put myself in that camp. I think the sooner we can get through this difficult period, the better, because you're going to have a new government coming to power in a matter of weeks in Canada. You've got Sheinbaum with still a large mandate in Mexico, and obviously the Trump administration hasn't even completed 100 days. So there's plenty of fresh thinking and fresh mandates in all three countries. Frankly, if we can get it done faster, the better, and then we can start providing some of our industries and companies more security, hopefully, moving forward so that we can continue to build on North American supply chains. That would be my position.
As we kind of move south of Mexico, what role do you see the Latin America countries playing in U.S. trade policy? We mentioned earlier the Panama Canal. Secretary of Defense was just there. Looks like that issue is coming to an end successfully, at least from the Trump administration. How do you see not just the Panama Canal, but the other issues playing out in terms of U.S. trade policy?
Well, I think that there are certain industries that are going to thrive in other places. I mean, if you look at, for example, semiconductors, something we haven't talked about much in this podcast yet, but a critical industry we've done some work on before. And there are plenty of jurisdictions outside of Mexico, outside of Canada, that are really important in the Western Hemisphere. They're important from a mineral standpoint. So when China responds to tariffs by saying we're not going to export critical minerals anymore, things like gallium and germanium, which are essential for the manufacturing of semiconductors, there's a good LATAM story to be told there, Jake, about where can we find alternatives and where can we find alternatives in countries where we have free trade architecture already in place. I would just mention on the semiconductors issue, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Panama, these are all jurisdictions that got attention from the ITSE fund, the fund that does CHIPS diplomacy as part of the CHIPS and Science Act. We've actively made grants to all three of those countries, in addition to Mexico, to do workforce training, to map out supply chains, to talk about how we can deepen cooperation in this industry. So that's just one example of an area where outside of Mexico, there's an important role to play for the region as well. I would argue that we should be thinking about supply chain security from at least the southern border down to, say, Ecuador, maybe even Peru. All of those countries are physically close enough that they should be part of any kind of supply chain security strategy that we have in the United States. Unfortunately, the further down you get, if you're down in Chile, if you're way down in Argentina, these are pretty far away distance-wise, and you're not really talking about nearshoring or reshoring or friendshoring at that point, because you're not really shoring anything. You're still a pretty long ways away distance-wise. And so I've made the argument in many places before that there is a sort of proximity factor here. You're basically talking about, other than Canada, looking south, from the southern border, basically down to, to Ecuador, and obviously inclusive of the Caribbean as well.
Well, you mentioned a lot on access to critical minerals. It's not just the critical minerals themselves, but they have to be processed, refined, put into a capacity so that, they can actually, the semiconductor sector can build off of them. Where is that processing taking place, and where do you see it taking place over the years?
It depends on the mineral, but for the most part, we can make a sweeping generalization, which is that most processing and refining is taking place in China for most minerals. And so the US has focused a lot on sort of extraction. How do we get more mines open? How do we get more financing to mines? And that's probably step one, but we're probably in step two now, where we have to think about using public-private partnerships and other types of government support, perhaps, to actually build out more refining and processing operations in the Western Hemisphere. Again, if you still have China as part of the supply chain, in particular, the part of the supply chain that happens right after the extraction, you haven't really done anything in terms of building greater supply chain security when it comes to minerals. This was something that we used to do back in the day, Jake, but we have to be honest. Refining and processing has two things that we don't like. One is very, very small margins in terms of profit. So mining experts always say that refining and processing is strategically very important, but economically not super feasible, right? The margins are very, very thin, but also, and I think probably more important for the United States, it's very environmentally damaging, or there's a lot of environmental externalities, let's say. And you can process and refine in an environmentally friendly way, but of course you're going to drive up the cost and reduce those already thin margins of refining. And so back in the day, this was a thing that we were happy to see go to China. This was an environmental externality we were happy to export. Just to be honest about it, it's a dirty industry, right? And now we're realizing that that's a major supply chain vulnerability. The good news is that the DFC and other types of support mechanisms the United States has, they understand this, and they're interested in investing in more refining and processing potential in the Western Hemisphere. And Western Hemisphere countries are more open to the idea of hosting and processing facilities, because they want to get away from being just suppliers of raw materials, and they too want to build more vertically integrated supply chains within their countries. And so it seems as though there is actually a match here. The problem is that the Chinese have been very, very smart over the last several decades And they have protected their advantage in processing and refining by using long-term offtake agreements with many mining companies to guarantee a certain number of years that you can send your product to China and at a certain price point, right? So it might not be what the market is fetching at the moment, but it's a stable price point from now until, the end of the decade, let's say. And so whether that goes up or whether that goes down, remember minerals markets are famously quite volatile. You have a stable price point. And right now, the US hasn't figured out a way to compete with China's long-term offtake agreements as their kind of protective mechanism against all this advantage.
And that's even before you get to the refining facilities. You mentioned public-private partnerships. Are you hearing discussions of some type of, government incentives similar to the CHIPS Act for the processing? Would that be in the US or are other countries in Western Hemisphere looking at that?
So, for example, rare earths, something that's extremely important for the defense industrial base, magnets, electric vehicles, batteries, all of that kind of stuff. There's only one facility in the United States that does it. It's supported in part by the Pentagon because a lot of its final products then go to the defense industrial base. There's another facility that they're aside of Mountain Pass that they are working on building, but these things take time. So it's really at this point in time only the DFC that I know of that is actively considering partnering with private sector companies and taking equity stakes in building refining and processing capabilities in the Americas. What they did in the last administration was actually take equity stakes in mining operations, right? The DFC now owns a mine in Piauí, Brazil, for example. That was like one of the first it had in the Western Hemisphere. It's going to do probably the same thing with refining and processing, but it's going to take time to identify opportunities where China isn't already there present as the long-term off-taker. In the United States, Jake, it's going to take a while to identify states and areas that could actually build processing and refining capability because you're talking about, environmental regulations, you're talking about a number of other regulations that would have to be reduced in order to make that an attractive proposition. There are only a few states at the moment, like Texas, that would really offer a viable option.
I do wonder if we're going to see a project Stargate for AI for the critical minerals and rare earths for processing. But I guess, as you said earlier, time will tell. Ryan, as we look forward, what opportunities do you see for constructive U.S. engagement in Latin America that could actually strengthen the ties in the hemisphere?
Well, Jake, one of the things that I've been arguing in a few pieces, and I truly believe it, and this is a bit of a contrarian argument, the way in which the Trump administration is pressuring countries to move away from China and to more actively align with the United States on certain issues, it's reminding countries that there are not only red lines for the United States in very sensitive areas and sensitive technologies where we want to be the preferred partner, but it's also made countries reflect on just how much China has grown in the region in the last couple of decades. And I have a sense that whereas many analysts think that the United States is going to lose out because countries are going to run to China because they're afraid of a more assertive posture of the United States in the region, I actually think quite a few countries feel as though China grew too big, too fast in the region over the last 2.5 decades, and they'd like to balance away from the PRC. The United States offers them one opportunity, but there are also other countries interested in expanding their approach and their influence in the region. The Europeans have been active in the region recently on all the issues we've talked about, semiconductors, critical minerals, rare earths, and other things. The Japanese are present in certain places. The Australians are becoming ever more present. Even the Gulf states, Jake. When I go to conferences, investor conferences and academic conferences on things like development, supply chains, and so on, there's a lot of folks from Gulf countries as well thinking about investing in the region. India is more and more present. It's coming a more diversified space, but the important point here is less and less China, right? More United States and then more diversification beyond the United States. So that's just a macro comment to say the US is not in as difficult a spot as many of the talking heads would like you to think. I think starting at the sort of bottom of the supply chain of some of these tech sectors with the critical minerals, there's a huge opportunity to build or start thinking about a region-wide strategy for minerals or for building the foundation of some critical technologies, starting with minerals, but also going to other resources and thinking about it as an America's only kind of vertically integrated supply chain where the raw materials and some of the refining might be done in the region, but then you've got high-tech manufacturing in the United States. Maybe you have things going over a border or two before a final product is made. But there's a lot of value, and that basically cuts out China in many ways. So that's just one example. I mean, there's all sorts of other things where countries want to partner with us, areas where we have the lead. Countries are really desperate and really eager for AI attention. They're really eager for cloud computing partnership. They're really eager for a number of tech industries where we lead, and they're looking to sort of leapfrog some of their technologies.
So for businesses that are already in various countries throughout Western Hemisphere or looking to invest, what advice do you give businesses so that, they are not caught in the crosshairs between whether it's a US-China issue or even US-Mexico or Panama, et cetera?
Well, I think just generally we need to be much more attentive to regulatory landscapes and issues that could be coming down the pike in the United States. But I think the tariff regime for now is going to be relatively stable, which is to say, most of the countries are going to remain with the 10% baseline. The few that I mentioned with higher than 10%, probably not going to get those off anytime soon. And then North American exemptions. I feel like we're at the stage, at least in the reciprocal tariffs, Jake, where countries are coming to negotiate now with the Trump administration. Much of the bandwidth of the administration is going to be caught up in negotiating down those tariffs and hopefully getting more access for US companies, right? Tariff and non-tariff barrier alike. And so you're not going to have the bandwidth to necessarily lower the 10% baseline tariff. You're probably also not going to have the bandwidth to pursue another investigation or a new set of tariffs. So I think for now, we're in the middle of the donut, if you will, where things are relatively stable and you can basically just assume that about a 10% baseline tariff is more or less where things are going to stand for now. And the other thing we forgot to mention, Jake, is that Latin America and the Caribbean is the region of the world where the US has the most trade architecture. So if you're a business and you're thinking about investing in the region, you've got protections, you've got regulations that are harmonized, you've got all sorts of things that make it more attractive in theory for you to invest. Frankly, the only country on the Pacific coast that doesn't have a trade agreement with the United States is Ecuador. Right? Other than that, we've got the entire Pacific coast from the southern border down to the tip of Patagonia covered. It's a pretty impressive trade architecture the US maintains in the region. And I think there's a real reason, if you look at it, there's a real reason why there's only 10% baseline tariff on almost every country. The US has trade surpluses with pretty much every country in the region, except for Mexico and Canada for very obvious and peculiar reasons or particular reasons. Where the US has all this free trade architecture, we tend to compete well and we tend to run trade surpluses. They buy our products, they buy our services, and you've got the protections that you need.
I just remind folks that the analysis, the trade surplus or deficit is solely focused on goods. We run a surplus, so that speaks volume. So Ryan, if there's one policy change that you could recommend to improve US Latin America relations, what is it?
So I wish that we would have the conversation about which sectors we want to compete in. The old saying of if you don't have a set of priorities, you're not doing anything at all, right? I think is sometimes true in Latin America. We know that we want to compete. We've got our competitive juices flowing. We've got our sights on China. We're talking about North America as a fortress. We're talking about trying to compete with China, even outside of North America. But we can't compete everywhere. And we've let our guard down over the last 2 decades or so. And China has advanced in a number of different industries. The answer can't simply be, Jake, we're going to compete everywhere and anywhere and wherever the Chinese are present. You have to choose your 3 to 5 focus industries for competition. And I don't think any administration yet has had that conversation because they haven't decided which industries are going to be the industries where dominance over those industries basically allows you to write the next chapter of global economic governance. I have my ideas. You probably have yours. I think we have to compete in areas like semiconductors, cloud computing, AI, the things where last I checked, we were firmly in the lead. China over the last couple of decades has gotten a lot of soft power. They've gotten a lot of political power in countries, especially with certain parties, building hard infrastructure, right? Airports, roads, bridges, things that are important, where the US frankly wasn't that present over the last 2 decades. But now countries are starting to look to the infrastructure of the future. Much of it is digital. If we don't look to compete in these areas, Huawei is going to fill the void. So My argument would be to look more in the digital space. We don't do physical infrastructure particularly well in the United States. We're probably not going to do it particularly well in Latin America if that became our way of engaging. But we simply haven't had that conversation. We haven't had the policy conversation about the areas where we wanted to prioritize competition with China. So we're all over the place. We want to do mining, we want to do ports, we want to do space, we want to do all sorts of things, but we haven't had the conversation yet, in my opinion, about those priority areas. And that would be one thing I would really like to see happen in this administration so that we have a justification for why we're prioritizing these areas and not others. And of course, people would disagree with that. People would argue against whatever the selection ended up being, but at least we would have a set of rules and expectations about the priorities where institutions like DFC are going to play.
I just wonder if USTR ends up, fleshing out a lot of these agreements, like the bilateral investment treaties they have, and turning them into full-fledged trade agreements. Is there an opportunity that the market will address those sectors if you have, rule of law, international standards? You kind of go through, non-tariff trade barriers, all of those issues. Could those sectors essentially be self-selected?
I think they could. Markets haven't stopped wanting the things that you've just named. I mean, that's essentially the ingredients of a strong investment climate, right? Predictable regulations, sound government, evidence-based policymaking, a trade agreement with legal protections,
IP protection,
regulatory harmonization, data protection, IT, all of those things. And so it might well be that these are sort of self-selecting. For various reasons in our domestic politics, we don't really talk of forging new trade agreements, right? So I think the investment agreements that exist in the region will just remain where they're at. They probably won't be enhanced to be called something else for political reasons. But you're right about that there could be a kind of self-selection of the industries.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your experience. And thank you all for tuning in to Coffee, Trade, and Tech, the series of Tholos Talks that unpacks the 21st century issues facing the global economy. Join us next time as we continue to explore critical trade and technology issues impacting our economy and national security.
Thank you for listening to Tholos Talks, a series by the Basilinna Institute, available on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Make sure to follow and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date on upcoming episodes. To learn more about these topics or the work we're doing, visit the Basilinna website.